Hey guys, so this lesson is about input and variables. Now so far, we haven't really been able to interact with the user in our programs. We've just been able to get our programs to do some stuff, but it gets a whole lot more exciting when we're able to interact with the user and write programs and make decisions based on what the user says. So that brings us to the topic of variables. Now you can kind of think of a variable as a box. It's a location in memory really, but you can think of it as a box that we put something into. And there are different kinds of things that we can put into these boxes or into a box. And there are 4 different types of values that we're going to be mostly using. And the first is integers. Now an integer could be any number, positive or negative, as long as it's not a decimal or a fraction, that sort of thing. So an example, 4 is an integer, right? And so is the number 3, so is the number negative 1,000. Those are all integers. Now the next kind of variable that we'll be using would be called floating point numbers. And floating point numbers are numbers, as you would probably have guessed, except they're numbers with decimal points. We'll just think of them as that way. So 1.33, that's a floating point number. It's not an integer because it has a decimal place. 2.6, for example, is another floating point number, or negative 0.1, another floating point number. Strings are just lists of characters, and so we think of a string as my name, for example, Mr. Pollock would be a string, and usually we think of strings as being inside quotation marks. Another example would be the word class, etc. And the last one is Boolean. And a Boolean only has 2 possible values. It's either true or it's false. Those are the only 2 things that it could possibly be. Now when we're writing programs, we get to decide what the variables are going to be named. So here are the 5 rules for naming your variables. Number 1, it should be descriptive. Okay, so for example, our variable could be called height or age or something like that. Okay, number 2, you want to start with a lowercase letter. Start with a lowercase letter. You can have capitals in it, but make sure that the first one is lowercase. Point number 3 is there should be no spaces in your variable name. In fact, if you have spaces in your variable name, it's going to think that it's more than one variable and you're going to end up with errors. So no spaces. An example, let's say a 2-word example, you want to use the variable called myPassword. Well, there's 2 ways we could do this. We could have my_password, or we could instead call it myPassword. I kind of prefer the underscore as it's a little bit easier to read, but both of these work. Neither of them have a space in them, and neither of them start with an uppercase letter. Point number 4 is don't make it too crazy long. And possibly the most important point is no reserved words. And you already know some of these words that you can't use as a variable. For example, the word print. That already gets used in our coding. Integer, float, bool, string. Now if you've ever taken a programming course before, you've probably run into the fact that you need to declare your variables before you use them. Now if you've used Turing at all, this is how you would declare a variable. You would say var radius : int. We're saying I have a box and my box is called radius, and radius holds integer values. In other words, radius could equal a 1 or a 2 or a negative 100, but it can't be decimal numbers, it can't be strings like someone's name, and it can't be true or false. And then we're going to say, oh, radius is actually equal to 5. So when the program runs, where it sees the word radius, it's really reading the number 5. Okay, well, Python's a little bit different than that. So for example, in Python, you could just say radius is 5. And that's all there is to it. Now let's write a super short little program to make sure that this is working right. Let's use a print statement. And we'll say print the area of a circle with radius of our radius is the answer. Okay, next we use our %sign, and our first little placeholder right here is circle with a radius of whatever the value of radius is, so we'll put radius. So whatever radius is, it's going to pop it into this first spot, and the answer that we want right here will be the area. And the way we calculate area of a circle is pi r squared. So we'll go 3.14 times the radius, and the radius is going to be squared. So remember, double star means to the power of 2. So 3.14 times the radius squared, which will be the area. And then we close off our print statement with our last bracket, and we can run it. The area of a circle with a radius of 5 is 78.5. So we know it's working. Now, I just want to point out something here, which might not be evident to everyone, but the order does matter. You can't use a variable in a program until it's already been declared at some point. So for example, if I were to take this radius line and move it down here, when the program runs, it's going to read from the top down, and as it goes down, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to go to this print line, and I'm going to print out the area of a circle with the radius of something is something, and then we look over here at these somethings, it's going to say, okay, radius. Wait, radius, I don't know what radius is. So I'll show you when we go and try to run it this way. It gives us an error, and it says, name error, the name radius is not defined. It doesn't know what radius is because it got here and it tried to use it, and it didn't know what it was. And that's because we defined it after we tried to use it. So you have to define a variable before you actually use it at all. So that's all nice if we want the radius to be 5 every single time we run this program. But what happens if we want to actually get the radius from the user and calculate the area for them? Well, that's pretty easy. We're going to say radius is equal to input, and we can prompt the user inside these input brackets. In other words, when we go to run the program, we want to ask the user for the radius. Otherwise, how do they know what we want to get from them? So we'll put input, what is the radius? So what's going to happen is this is going to get printed to the screen, and it's going to wait for the user to enter some sort of radius and then hit the enter key. And then after that, it's going to take that value and put it into radius and run this print line. So let's go ahead and run it. And I'm just going to tell you right ahead of time that we're going to get an error. So what is the radius? I'll hit 5 and hit enter. Oh, error. And the error is actually whenever we get input from the user, it always takes the input as a string. So there's two ways we can get around this. One way would be to change inside this print statement the fact that radius is not actually a string. We want it to be an integer. Or when we first take the value from the keyboard, we can make sure that it gets converted into an integer there. So the way we can do that is we're going to put this into brackets, take our input and put it into brackets, and we're going to put the word int. So it's going to take our input, convert it into an integer, and then store that value into the radius. So if we run it again, what is the radius? Press 5. The area of a circle with a radius of 5 is 78.5. It works just fine. So let's come up with a new example. Let's say we have a number, and we're going to get that number from the user. And now remember, as it stands right now, the number that we're going to be getting is technically a string. So we're going to have to change that number into an integer. And let's say a second number, we can set its value to the first number, and then now we can print that value. And if we go ahead and run it, enter the number 5, for example, and it says the number you entered was 5. Everything's working good. Now we can also do math with variables. We can say that num2 is actually num1 plus 1. So whatever number we enter, it's going to print out a number that's higher than that. The number you entered plus 1 is equal to, and let's go ahead and run it. Enter a number, 9. The number you entered plus 1 equals 10. And of course we can get multiple inputs from the user. So for example, let's get 2 numbers from the user. And now we can print out the values added together to the screen. So enter a number, 4, enter another number, 2, and when I hit enter, it should add them together and print out the number 6. And we can see that it does. Okay, last 2 examples. The first one's a little bit based on the printing the stars using the repeat function. So let's call a variable stars to decide how many stars we want to print. And we're going to say stars equals an integer input. And we'll prompt the user by saying, how many stars do you want? And then we're going to print that many stars to the screen. So we're going to print a star. How many times? Well, as many times as the user is said to do. So if we go ahead and run it, how many stars do you want? Well, let's say 52. And there you go, there's 52 stars. You count them if you want. And the very last example is we don't have to take integers. We could also take floating point numbers, which is just the word float rather than int. Or if we're just taking strings, we don't need anything because remember, it always takes input as strings anyway. So I'm going to write one last program, and I'm going to ask the user for their name. And then I'm going to print them a nice welcome message. So what we're doing here is we're taking the name of the person as an input from the keyboard and storing it into the variable name. And then when we print this message, remember this %s, the percent right here for name, that value is going to be placed right here in this print statement. So if we run one last time, what is your name? My name is Mr. Pollock. Hit enter. Welcome to class, Mr. Pollock. Okay, and that's it for input and variables.